Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into the wild economic story of a country that managed to stay officially neutral during World War II. While most of Europe was a battlefield, Portugal's economy was on one heck of a roller coaster all on its own.
So here's the big question, right? Portugal was neutral. You'd think that means they were stable, kind of like a safe harbor in a massive storm. But nope. For Portugal, it was the exact opposite. Their fortunes were tangled up with the war in some really surprising and really dramatic ways.
All right, so let's talk about that first crash. You might be picturing invading armies or bombed-out factories, but that's not what happened. To really get what went down, we have to look at something much more basic. We have to look at the land itself.
I mean, get this. Over half, 53% of the entire Portuguese workforce was in agriculture. Think about that. That means the whole economy was basically balanced on a knife's edge, totally dependent on harvests, on crop yields, and totally at the mercy of one big, unpredictable thing: the weather.
And, well, you can probably guess what happened next. Just as the world is tipping into the chaos of war in 1939, bam, Portugal gets slammed with its own crisis right at home. The timing couldn't have been worse. Disastrously bad harvests.
And we're not talking about a small dip here. The scale of this collapse was just staggering. Olive oil production, a huge part of their economy, it fell by over half, 54%. Wine, another major export, dropped by almost a third. It was just a total, devastating wipeout of their most important products, all at the same time.
So this is really the key point to grab onto. The recession in 1940, it wasn't really about the war, not directly anyway. This was a homegrown crisis. It was a catastrophic failure in their own farmlands that just yanked the entire economy down with it.
And this pain wasn't just some number on a chart. People felt this, in their daily lives. Rationing became the new normal. Fuel was only available 3 days a week. You needed coupons for basics like cod and olive oil. They even rationed electricity. It got so serious that folks living in cities were actually allowed to raise chickens on their balconies. Just imagine that.
But then, just as things looked completely bleak, the roller coaster took a sharp turn upwards. Almost as fast as it crashed, the economy started to absolutely soar. And the reason for this whiplash? One single thing. A dark, super dense metal that both sides of the war wanted, badly.
And that metal was tungsten, or wolframio, as they call it in Portugal. Now this stuff is special. It's incredibly hard and heat-resistant, which made it absolutely critical for the war effort. We're talking about the key ingredient for making steel tough enough for armor-piercing shells, machine tools, you name it. It was the secret sauce for the war machine.
So, this put Portugal in let's call it a very interesting position. Because they were the biggest producer in Europe, they started selling tungsten to both sides, the Allies and the Axis. And here's the kicker. The Allies weren't just buying it for themselves. A huge part of their strategy was just to buy it all up so the Germans couldn't get it. This, as you can imagine, kicked off an absolutely insane bidding war.
So what happens when two superpowers are desperately trying to outbid each other for the same thing? The price goes through the roof. I mean, get this. Between 1938 and 1942, the price Portugal was getting for its tungsten went up by 32 times. That's not a typo. 32x. Just unbelievable.
What followed was basically a modern-day gold rush, but for tungsten. Everyone was trying to get in on it, and with prices and production soaring, this one single mineral suddenly made up nearly 40% of Portugal's entire export value. It was like winning the lottery. The country's finances were transformed practically overnight.
This boom was so huge, it did something that was, well, kind of unthinkable at the time. It completely flipped Portugal's trade balance upside down. They were exporting so much more than they were importing that they went from a country in debt to a country that was lending money. They were even lending massive amounts to the United Kingdom.
But you know how these stories go, right? A boom that's built on just one thing, especially when you're selling it to two sides of a world war, is incredibly fragile. And just as fast as it appeared, it was all about to disappear. A perfect storm was brewing, a mix of high-stakes diplomacy and, you guessed it, the weather.
Two huge shocks hit Portugal, almost at the same time. First, the worst drought in the country's recorded history kicks off in 1943. And then, a year later, with the Allies gaining the upper hand in the war, they put the squeeze on Portugal, big time. They basically forced them to cut off all tungsten sales. To everyone. The tap was turned off.
And that was the devastating 1-2 punch. The river of money from tungsten just dried up. Exports collapsed. And at the very same moment, that brutal drought was crippling the farms all over again. I mean, it was an absolute nightmare scenario for the economy.
Okay, so let's recap. The war's winding down, the tungsten money is gone, the farms are bone dry. This has all the makings of a total economic catastrophe, right? A deep, long depression. But here's the twist. That's not what happened.
So what saved them? The big difference this time around was how the government reacted. Right as the private economy was hitting the floor, public investment shot way up. The government jumped in, dusted off these huge public works projects that had been sitting on a shelf during the war, and got to work. Think of this government spending as a giant parachute for the economy. They revived these ambitious old plans and started building all sorts of stuff. Massive dams, thousands of new schools, tons of new roads. All that spending created jobs and pumped cash into the system, and it cushioned the fall. It prevented what could have been a much, much harder crash.
You know, one of the sources we looked at said it perfectly. That single decision to stop the tungsten trade, it just slammed the brakes on the whole economy. It's such a powerful reminder that Portugal's fate wasn't just about its own farms and mines. It was completely tied to the high-stakes game of diplomacy being played by the world's superpowers.
So in the end, the story of Portugal during the war is just fascinating. Here you have this neutral country just trying to stay out of it, but it gets tossed around on these violent waves of global conflict anyway. Yeah, its own weather caused problems, but its biggest boom and its biggest bust, those were decided by a war happening outside its borders. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much control does any country really have over its own destiny?